charter school capital, and it'll be shown again at the end. So what's going on in the market today? Over the last few years, both the proliferation of charter schools and the drop in rates has created more liquidity for charter schools, or more available capital for charter schools. But despite that, there is a significant lack of facilities access that is interfering with the growth of charter school movement and charter schools in general. Today, despite over 3 million students currently being educated at charter schools across the country, there are more than 1 million kids on wait lists without the ability to get in, mostly due to facilities constraints. While it is an opportunity to expand enrollment, expanding your capacity or facilities to get there is obviously an issue. Today, money is cheaper than really it's ever been since the charter school movement began. Rates are very low. However, over the past year, they have begun to rise in the market. There has been some interruption of the flow of funds as some of the bond market failures have caused people to pull back a little bit, and so rates have begun to rise. As a result, that you want to be for a long time for your school, seeking a way to lock in those rates is a good idea right now. And potentially, depending on your situation with your current landlord or in your current financing, you should evaluate the costs of the last thing on the market is how the market's impacting you varies significantly depending on your structure as a school, whether you're CMO, EMO, or an individual or independent school. Considering whether you're refinancing something or an ongoing school versus expansion versus startup and development. Obviously, the market impacts you in a different way. And finally, whether you're looking at long-term leases, bank funding, or bond financing. Also, they all have different issues, which we're going to walk through during the session today. So, if you're going to go out and get financing or build a facility or expand on your existing facility, refinance, etc., what control of your facility and location is what all charter schools require. Control is critical to maintaining stability, growth, and financial predictability for your organization. If you control your site and you can stay there as long as you want and you can update it and expand it and do all of those things, then you have really what you want. Ownership, from a conceptual standpoint, which most schools talk about, most schools think about ownership or say they want to own. However, the reality is that ownership is simply an investment. So what you need to run your school is operating flexibility and the capability to have students show up every day for as long as you want. Ownership, though, is just a question about how you want to allocate your capital and whether you think the real estate market's going up versus down, how much it costs you to acquire and own something. But having control is a different and lesser issue that accomplishes the goals of the school. Second thing to think about is evaluating total dollars spent as opposed to percentage rates. Most loans and bonds are quoted in an interest rate. However, that rarely captures all of the fees, transaction costs, etc., associated with a transaction. And we recommend that you evaluate the actual dollar cost of whatever program you're entering into, since you pay for teachers and salaries with dollars, not rates, and rates can often be very misleading. An apparent high rate for one type of financing structure could actually cost your school less in total dollars than an advertised lower rate. So looking at the details, reading the fine print, etc., is important. Third thing to consider, cost is not just money. The time and opportunity costs for your management team in your organization is critical. Schools and organizations make very heavy investments at times when they're growing quickly or they have other constraints and would be better off focusing on delivering the educational models that you all lead as opposed to spending time out on a road show trying to raise money. So please consider that as you go forward. Other things to think about that are related are certain structures or options presented in the market today. While they may look inexpensive, they have a very high risk of funding failure, which is you do all the work, you rely if you were betting on it. So certainly consider that going forward. And then related is the total elapsed time to complete funding. Some of these programs take 6 to 12 months to get going, whereas others might take 30 days or so to get money locked in. And finally, structural constraints vary significantly. They can create very burdensome covenants and restrictions on your organization and limit your future options. So again, the rights and controls are something to think about as you look at any of these options. Whatever you create, whatever facility houses your school, making sure you have the minimums you need to deliver on your academic mission, your growth plan for attendance should be, and enrollment should be considered. Any focused on special needs kids, or you have other specific elements of your program, obviously ensuring that your facility allows that is important. And there may be local considerations depending on the municipality that your school is based in, or specific requirements associated with weather, et cetera. And while these things may seem obvious, sometimes schools will get in situations where they what they think is they have a great deal for a facility or location, but in the end, it doesn't really serve their needs. On the flip side, in the column on the left, what can we afford? Looking at your existing cash reserves, having a sustainable ongoing percentage of revenue that you can afford to pay out in lease payments or debt service. The fundraising you have access to, either public or private, for charitable contributions or other subsidies. And then what are your different funding alternatives are all things you need to think about as you prepare for a new or expanded facility. On this chart on page 10, there's somewhat simplistic analysis around what can your organization afford. And really it's based largely on your annual school revenues. So on the column on the left, or if you look at the vertical axis, things range from they should be dollar signs. Across the horizontal or x-axis, things range around your annual school revenues from 0 to 10 million in this example. And you should see 3 separate lines looking at your cost as a percentage of revenue going forward. Depending on what state you're in, the stage of development you're at, your total overall enrollment, your growth plans, et cetera. Obviously, being at 10% facilities cost as a percentage of revenue is better than being at 20%, but our experience is you can have a successful and sustainable academic program if you're at 20%. Way to think about how much can I afford, depending on what your academic model requires. Any of these factors may be relevant, but in this example, if you look at the $4 million annual school revenue, you can see that from an ongoing project standpoint, the question is, well, how much can I afford? And at 20% facilities cost as a percentage of revenue, if you can get the financing or you have the capital, you can afford an $8 million project or building. If you have $6 million in revenue ongoing, or that's the enrollment you're going to have, you could afford, depending on whether you're at 10%, you would have a $6 million building. At 20% rent to revenue, you could afford a $12 million building. So ongoing costs for facilities, and also must take into account the actual costs of financing. We've, for this analysis, simplistically assumed the market averages, but frankly, this is a tool that should be customized for your organization, but it's a critical piece of analysis before you go into any facilities plan or project. Okay. There are many, many options out there in the market, and all different shades of the various things that are out there and offered. Today, we want to talk about 4 core options that really frame everything available to schools. And we're going to compare them against 6 different criteria. We're using, for purposes of this, a $7 million example project. So to orient you to what you're looking at, I know it's a dense amount of information. We're going to walk through this. The criteria we're comparing are down the left side: cash needed to close, the annual cost to facilities cost associated with these, growth options going forward should you enter into one of these structures, and other considerations or challenges. So the first option, which is not available to very many schools, is to look at or think about, hey, what if I just have all $7 million in cash? Well, if you're going to do it for cash, you need all $7 million. Most schools don't have it sitting there in the bank or in the mattress, but that is one structural option. The ongoing cost associated with posting $7 million in cash is 0. Of course, you have maintenance costs and other things, but the cost of the financing is 0 going forward because you pay for it all yourself. The underwriting requirements are simple. There are none. If you feel like doing it, hey, you've got the cash. You can do whatever you want with it. There's no ongoing security interest. Your growth options are limited, however, to, in order to do things going forward, you will, again, need to have the cash. And then finally, the primary consideration or challenge is, do I have the reserves, donations, or funds to do it? The answer for most schools is no, but most of the more sophisticated leaders in the country would say, even if you have the cash. Green Dot CFO Sabrina Ayala said at the national conference last year that she'd done one transaction because they had the cash, they'd done it for cash, and she said it was the worst transaction they ever did. And in fact, going forward, she would always do some sort of financing. The fact here is that if you utilize If you have $7 million, you could be investing that in growth, expansion, improving your academic programs, et cetera. Investing it just to sit in the real estate, given rates and availability today and the flexibility of some of these structures, is not useful. But in the end, most schools don't have that as an option anyway. Banking. Traditional banks will fund charter schools. They tend to, if you look down at the underwriting field, require a minimum of 5 years of operations. They evaluate your ongoing surplus, or for-profit entities, your profitability. But frankly, everything is a picture of what assets do you have in an organization, the ongoing revenues and the predictability of those. And if you qualify, usually those of cash to support the bank loan. So in this example, you'd have to put up $2.1 to $2.8 million. Because you're financing not the full $7 million, but you're financing $4 to $5 million, your ongoing annual costs are significantly lower. Rates in the market for this analysis are looking at 6% rates, but your ongoing payments will be both the interest you're paying on the $4 to $5 million borrowed, plus the amortization schedule, whether you're paying it off in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. This range assumes a 10 to 20-year amortization. We've talked about the underwriting requirements. You can evaluate whether your school might qualify. The security interest for bank loans is you have to post all the real estate in the event you miss payments. The bank takes the school property and all additional assets, including all your revenue streams. So once you have a bank line in place, typically you will not be able to get other forms of financing, such as working capital or other growth capital for furniture and fixtures, facilities, technology, et cetera. Growth options going forward. Really two things to think about. If you wanted to expand or get financing later, what the market is today is not necessarily what it'll be a few years from now. With it for the life of the loan. The other is even if somebody is willing to refinance down the road for you to get out of that transaction and move into another one, rates may be higher, and given what's going on at the Fed and in the overall economy, that is likely over the next 5 to 10 years that rates will be much higher than they are today. Other considerations and challenges, we've talked about a little bit, the amortization term and the equity or the cash you have to post. Again, if you have that and can support that, a bank option is a very good option for schools. The bond market. Most people out there in the charter school world have heard about bonds as the primary vehicle to fund charter schools. The reality is that only 9% of the charter schools in the country have ever been financed via bond transactions. Cash needed to close for a bond, you need to post a few $100,000, maybe $500,000 before you get the bond issued. You'll also have other obligations, and those obligations that you may incur may rise to more than $1 million, all of which you're incurring prior to knowing whether you're going to have the bond in place. The annual cost of a bond rates are lower than they've ever been for charter schools, but they range pretty widely depending on the size of the transaction you're entering into, the maturity of your organization. So if you qualify, the rates still vary pretty wildly, typically from 6 to 9% today in the market. From an underwriting standpoint, you'll need a minimum of 3 years, but most bonds also want schools to be 5 years or more. They seek the debt coverage associated with, again, the surplus or profitability of your organization to make sure you can make payments. There are opportunities sometimes, depending on the strength of your organization and school, or state subsidies available in some states to go get a rating, which can reduce the rate. However, it creates more significant upfront costs, and you're not guaranteed to get that rating. Security interest for the bond is the real estate itself and all other assets and revenues of the school. That situation, to be clear, the difference between the bonds and a traditional bank financing is a bond should provide 100% financing. The transaction costs associated with the bond are extremely high. They're not usually something that schools pay that close attention to, but the legal costs associated with it and brokerage fees, et cetera, mean you're really financing generally about 20% more built into the transaction for fees, costs, et cetera, and interest reserves than you are in other forms here. So the project is, you're not getting 20% more building, you're just getting 20% more cost going forward. And to get a bond in place, there is typically a significant roadshow involved where management has to meet with various investors and organizations and prepare pretty significant paperwork associated with going to market. Transactions also typically take 6 to 12 months to get done. And again, there's a risk that they don't ever get completed despite your effort, energy, and investment. Most charter schools start out with some form of lease, but the typical landlord and lease arrangement is shorter term, usually less than 5 years. And schools get concerned that they will not have control of their property at the end of the 1, 3, or 5-year lease. That's a good concern to have because the landlord could decide they're selling it, they're converting it to another form of building, they're going to switch in another school, or they're going to raise your rates significantly. Over the last 5 or 6 years, long-term leases have actually become available to charter schools where commercial real estate funds and other organizations interested in investing in charter schools long-term are willing to provide 20, 30, 40-year leases, providing the control that schools want, but not providing the schools the ownership. So the fund is investing in the real estate value while the school gets a predictable, committed long-term cost of use of the facility, has control over the facility, and can sustain operations for as long as they want. Long-term leases and these options in general take very little cash to close, generally less than $100,000 or as little as zero cost to the school. The annual cost, depending on the maturity and viability of your organization, is typically similar to the bond market. Most people are surprised to hear that, in part because they think lease rates, when they think about interest rates, tend to be higher. But in a lease, you're not paying off the principal. There's no amortization of the principal involved. As a result, you can have a lease that tends to provide long-term access at an annual operating cost that is the same or lower than a bond. From an underwriting standpoint, the minimum years of operations are not there in the market. Obviously, some organizations have some minimums, but there are others that don't. Academic success is a key factor in any of these structures, including the lease, and leases tend to be pretty flexible from an underwriting standpoint. The reason an investor would do one school versus another varies, but they tend to be significantly more flexible than banks or the bond market. As a result, as noted, most schools actually do enter into some form of lease, though not always long-term leases. From a security interest standpoint, the landlord owns the real estate, and there's no other security interest typically provided or required by schools. From a growth option standpoint, these investors provide scalability and really an expandable option for charter schools, because the investors tend to be interested in, if as a school you've been a good tenant, paying the rent, then they'd be happy to invest to expand it because it increases their rent over time, and that's what they do for a living. This option offers 100% financing. As noted, there's no amortization, which is one of the things that keeps the cost low, and they usually have some option for the school to buy the property down the road if the school wants to enter into an ownership or investment situation. We thought we'd summarize a little bit more detail on the bond market requirements. Since the 1990s, so over the last 25 years, as noted, only 9% of charters nationwide have received bond market financing. They require a pledge of your state funding and revenues that get assigned to a trustee. There are a set of debt reserves required, usually a year, sometimes more than that, such that if the school fails to pay, the bondholders are still getting their money for at least a year while foreclosure and other things occur. That said, you're just paying to finance that when you're doing the bonds, and most people don't think about that, but it is a significant issue. The covenants that are looked for beyond just making the payments are, you typically have to have 30 to, it says 45, I've seen 60 to 90 on some, but typically 30 to 45 days of cash on hand at all times. If you drop below that, the bond trustee and the bondholders can step in and force the school to engage in other activities or potentially foreclose, though that wouldn't likely happen that radically. From a debt service ratio standpoint, you have to be able to cover not just your debt service, but 10% more than that. There are other covenants that are restrictive around making sure you have sufficient capital on hand at all times, including having the money to engage in capital improvements or maintain the property, and insurance restrictions. So how do you think about and compare these different options in summary? We went through the details, but let's kind of try to bring all that together. Obviously, if you're funding a $5 million project, that's very different than funding a $20 million project. But this is a way to think about this that you should see on your screen now, red light, yellow light, green light pictures in summary evaluating or comparing these different options. So red, bad, red, stop, green, go. Yellow, things to think about, but certainly possible. The cash column or cash transactions, the biggest constraint is cash needed. You need a lot of it. In the banking option, you need significant cash, so that's yellow. Bonds and long-term leases, while the lease would require very little cash, the bonds require some, but it's still relative to the opportunity. These are good options because you're going to get 100% financing. Your annual ongoing costs, they're obviously the best for cash and nearly that good from a traditional bank because you're only financing part of the project. The bonds and leases tend to be similar, but on a $5 million project, the bond market is red because the transaction costs are so big relative to the total cost of the project that it ends up being much significantly more expensive than a long-term lease. And frankly, it's hard to get a $5 million or less bond done. Most underwriters won't bother or do it. From an underwriting standpoint, banks and bonds tend to be very restrictive, thus those are red. On smaller projects, they usually get screened out and it's not an option as mentioned. Long-term leases tend to be more flexible. From a security interest standpoint, the bonds are most restrictive because they're really locking up all the funds to support the entire bond, which is 100% financing. banks are a little bit better because you haven't financed as much. Long-term leases are the most flexible on that front from a security interest standpoint. And from a growth option standpoint, the lease is the least restrictive, and you generally have a party most interested or available to fund ongoing expansion or changes. The bond market is very restrictive. Most bonds today have a 10-year restricted covenant where you can't refinance or buy out the bond or move away from that financing for a minimum of 10 years. Even if you wanted to, there's a legal or contractual obligation to not do that. And while you can refinance the bank options, they tend to be restrictive because you never know whether they're going to be available or interested in refinancing down the road. Now, when we compare the same thing to a larger project, three things change. On a $20 million project evaluated here, for example, the cash needed for traditional bank financing becomes quite significant. You probably need to post $6 to $8 million to get that done. In the bond market, the annual costs begin to look a lot better. So if you have a $20 million or bigger project, the transactions cost as a percentage of the overall program becomes smaller. The restrictions don't really change. The reason that we've added here that we've, from our standpoint, evaluated that the bond market becomes yellow for growth options is that although that 10-year restriction is typically still there and other restrictions, because you're looking at larger projects, the likelihood that you'll be able to get future financing down the road is much higher likelihood, and so you probably have some option of refinancing in the future. Funding approval and execution. What are the things people think about when they're looking at evaluating any charter? And this applies to really all of the options we've looked at except for cash. First, enrollment. Do you have stable or increasing enrollment? Financing sources all want to see strong demands for your program. They look for school leadership history. How long has your school been operating? Or if it's new or relatively new, do you have an experienced leadership team with a track record that supports success in the future? Do you have a history of strong academic performance, at least relative to the local competitive options at the district or other charter schools in the area or private schools? The third factor is the financials. We talked about requirements of less than 20% of total revenues spent on debt service or lease payments, but fundamentally the financials or numbers have to make sense to anybody looking at funding or investing in your school's real estate. They also, beyond evaluating your school and the financial strength of your school, will look at the valuation of the property that's being acquired or funded, because in the event the school fails, financing sources want to make sure they can do something with the underlying property. That's part of the reason they're entering into the financing in the first place. And lastly, issues around governance. Your relationship with your authorizer is critical, given that a bad relationship there could result in the revocation or non-renewal of your charter. The overall management approach to your school itself in terms of its operational excellence and the internal controls you've established also increase the confidence of funding sources. But everybody cares about these issues. As you think about planning and engaging in a project, these four summary points here are things to consider. First, plan ahead. No matter how long you think the project's going to take, you can expect it to take at least twice as long as whatever you anticipated. And the project begins before you break ground on something or fund the program. It is really thinking about and planning overall what are you doing from a program standpoint for your school. making sure you have stable leadership and a management team that's going to be there for the duration of your entire financing program, understanding what is critical to your academic performance going forward, and making sure that you have your financials in place and stable before you go to market. The second thing is to keep an eye on the financial market in general, or at least get advice from an expert or experts in this area. Pay attention to what's going on with rates, the flexibility of new products coming out, and watch for appropriate locations for your school if you're looking to move or if you're looking to expand, paying attention to the real estate near your property that may allow you to expand nearby. And then have realistic expectations. The market changes from a rate standpoint. There are other offers that come out. These are large transactions and big deals for a school. Your first choice may not work out. Be prepared to move forward steadily and not be betting or holding your breath that your one choice or one option works out. It usually requires a few different alternatives to be presented and looked at before you can get home. Line up internal resources. Your own team is going to be heavily relied upon in any of these scenarios, particularly the bond or bank financing market, where there will be extensive interviews, analysis of your underlying financials, your program, your academics, the team, your authorizer, et cetera. It will actually require a lot of work from management. Be prepared for that and make sure everybody on your team is ready to go. As you move into looking at the financing or the deal or the project itself, work with qualified or capable partners, particularly those who have charter school experience, and make sure before you move forward with the execution of a project, whether it's tenant improvements or expansion of your existing facility or a new build, make sure that you have the financing that supports the entire completion of the project lined up ahead of time. Or you could face a situation you get halfway there and run out of funds. Execution takes a lot of time. This chart on page 22 breaks down some of the things that are available to you or that you have to consider as you walk through. First is planning. Planning is not just the analysis of the space, but also the budget, the timeline. You may need charter approvals, et cetera, from your authorizer. Those are all things that have to be considered before you get going. Funding, we've talked about the different options there. Site acquisition, or in the case where you're already there, you may need new permits or preparation of the land as you move through that. It may require some zoning modifications, et cetera, that can take a long time. The design and build components are things that are often intimidating to people. They're also generally done together, though you can have separate architect and a separate general contractor building, but these are all things that you need to keep in mind, and there are typically different experts available in all these cases, but there are teams or organizations out there that do everything soup to nuts from the planning through construction stage and will guide you through the process, arranging the funding and financing, acquiring and modifying the site, and then designing and building the facility. So you can get it all in one shop or go to different parties. Thing to think about there is making sure you have people you're comfortable with, that you trust, because these are significant projects in the life of your school. Choosing a strong partner. We talked about full service resources, and we've discussed some of the different components there, but having a partner is going to be flexible and adaptive to the specific needs of your school is very important. Things will actually change as you go through, as you learn about different aspects of both the constraints of the school and the situation that the changes that your school may be facing, either with the authorizer, related to your charter, or things going on from an enrollment standpoint. Having somebody who's flexible enough to be able to modify the project needs, financial requirements, et cetera, as you go is important. Identifying somebody to be your investor, guarantor, or sponsor is great. that could be the party that's doing the funding, or it could be board members or others, or other community members that are supportive. Ensuring that you have access to working capital or growth capital beyond just the real estate funding is important. Most organizations that fund, whether it be the bond market, banks, or the long-term leases, are really focused solely on the land and building or the real estate itself, and often don't have furniture and fixture budgets available or funding available for you, or things to fund the increase you may need to support new enrollment, such as computers, textbooks, again, desks, buses, or other things that you may need to support the enrollment you're seeking when you expand to a new facility. And finally, thinking about total cost of ownership or control now versus later. We talked about the different structures, but being in a position to evaluate whatever your partner is looking for. Those parties that are interested in the long-term leases and who really want to be a partner with the school long-term, that typically carries a lower cost of overall control or ownership for the school than those like a developer or others who is going to cause you or really require you to refinance something in 3 to 5 years. They'll help you get started and launch, but some of the programs that you incur certain expense or your management time and commitment will require you to go refinance somewhere down the road. Things like new market tax credits have large balloon payments due at year 7 that require you to refinance. The other aspect from a total cost of ownership standpoint is, even though everything typically talking about is funding of the project, making sure you have enough room in your budget to handle maintenance issues or expansion and replacement issues, depending on what facility you're acquiring, is important to consider too. There are many options out there in the market. We talked about 4 core structural options, but there are variances on all of those. We talked about long-term leases. States often offer bond programs or subsidized programs for charter schools, depending on what state you're in. Some of the constraints around that are: 1, do you qualify? 2, how long will it take? 3, even if you qualify, is the money there to be released? There are states like California where they've had very large commitments of capital available to charters, but schools have been on waiting lists for as long as 6 to 8 years to get the money that was awarded to them. And that's something to keep in mind. Now, the benefits of a state bond program typically is very subsidized rates. They could be grant programs, or they could be 1 to 2% or 1 to 3% kind of ongoing interest rates. They're great programs once you have the money, but just getting the award is usually only the beginning of the qualification period of program. There are nonprofit or financial organizations associated with funding community development financing that are out there. They typically tend to be kind of zip code or locale restricted. So if you're in the right geography, great, or if you have the right population at your school, that can be great, but it's not readily available to all schools. We talked about the private bond market and your cash reserves increasing over time. New market tax credits is a form of bond that requires some other financial partners, but involves a grant or forgiveness of some components of the loan, where again, similar to community development funds, new market tax credits direct financial markets to invest in certain parts of the country, state, or region, and can be really useful. However, they do carry significant restrictions and are hard to get, and then typically there's a forced refinancing that occurs at year 7, so you have to do this all over again. EB-5 is a program that's been out for the last few years associated with the Federal Immigration Office. Biggest issues with EB-5 programs, they sound very inexpensive up front, but they tend to have also high fees associated with them. They typically force refinancing between years 3 and 5, so you have to pay for it again. EB5, however, is one of the great things about EB5 is that it tends to be available for startup organizations. In fact, it's usually only available to startup organizations or kind of first-year schools because it's based on the creation of new jobs. Other issues with EB5 lately is that federal immigration laws are changing. The markets are up and down, and over the past year there have been a high degree of failed EB5 transactions that schools were relying on that have forced the developers or the schools engaged in those projects to cancel the projects, lose their charter, or lose their enrollment because they were relying on these facilities being built and ready, and the EB5 funding fell through. The last one is the USDA has rural development funds available. Again, it's a federal program. Those are available for much more rural communities, but very low cost funding and great if you can get it. Tends to be smaller dollars typically, but a great subsidy, and it has the bureaucratic requirements of applying for federal funding. So we just wanted to list some of the options. As your organization grows and matures, you have more options as you go, but these are all other things to consider. We have a number of questions that have come up. I've tried to address them as we go, but there are a few that I want to touch on now briefly. One question that's been raised is charters often cannot line up financing until they have control of the desired property. I'm asking how a charter school navigates this issue. That really depends a little bit on that's a great question. For most funding sources, nobody wants to enter into something unless they have control of the site and facility, because while the school may be spending money, the financing source is also spending money, and more importantly for them, management time to conduct diligence, get a program together, negotiate the details of the financials, spend legal expense on surveys, etc. But you can often find a party, particularly more flexible in the long-term lease side than on the bond or banking side. Find somebody who will work with you, collaborate with the school to make an offer or lock up the property subject to diligence. So that's something to ask your potential financing partner whether they'll assist in that. Short of that, the school can engage a real estate broker and or hire somebody to present and acquire or lock up the property pursuant to a contract with a small deposit. But again, that's something that has to be negotiated, and the school would have to come up with the funds for that, not knowing that they have the financing arranged. So we would typically recommend that you work with a partner who can partner and collaborate with you to lock up the property together. At Charter School Capital, we typically do that for organizations. If you already have the property under contract, great, but if you don't, we'll work with you, when we're engaged in some kind of facilities financing program to work with you to lock up the property. Another question has been asked about startup charters and the difficulty of getting credit really across the board for businesses and vendors. There are charter school funding sources. Our organization does this. There are others out there that understand the challenges of charter schools and are willing to provide financing or credit, whether it be for real estate, in case we're talking about as a landlord or funding source, or for working capital and growth capital. That can really help you with other vendors and businesses who might question whether or not you're going to be viable or whether you'll be able to come through and pay for things. But if you present a funding partner with you, they'll often extend additional credit for some of these services like furniture and fixtures or technology components. A third question was raised about the challenges of having a charter, or your authorizer has only issued a charter for 5 years or less, and you're looking for long-term financing. How does that affect the financing? Well, it has a significant impact, but as the charter market has expanded, parties looking at long-term leases and those in the bond market can get comfortable, more typically on the leasing side, can get comfortable even though your school doesn't have a 20-year or 15-year charter. There are many states in the country where the longest charter that can even be issued is 5 years. So obviously that does affect the risk for the long-term investor. However, many organizations like ours who have significant experience with charter schools and understand that market we'll look at that, and we're really evaluating the likelihood that a school is going to be renewed or that charter will continue for the foreseeable future in our evaluation. So whether you actually do have a charter that long, which is obviously a positive, or not, the same analysis goes on. Are you going to be around long term? If you had a 20-year charter but your school's not doing very well, that charter could be revoked anyway. If you have a 5-year charter but it's doing extremely well with a waiting list, etc., you're likely to be renewed. So same event analysis kind of goes on whether you have a longer term charter or not. But that's a good question. There are questions raised about how much schools should be spending on rent, leases versus a purchase. I think the analysis is really the same. You have to look at your academic and financial model and determine how much you can afford. We'd say if on an ongoing basis you're spending more than 20% of revenue on an ongoing basis as part of your rent or lease payments or your debt service, you're spending too much. You will likely have trouble at above 20% kind of facilities cost, and I'm excluding maintenance costs here, but for your lease and or loan payments, if you're above 20% long term, it's going to be hard to maintain the competitiveness of your organization and a great academic program. That's our experience. In some markets, you could do that. In some structures, you could, because you have greater flexibility, and it varies depending on the specifics of your school. But those are guidelines that most financing sources will look at, and they look at that because that's a general experience in the market. Obviously, getting as low as possible is a good thing, but if you're under 20%, you're probably okay and can be competitive long term. Let's see. Last question here is a specific question around California, and that's Proposition 39 eligibility requirements. I'm going to address it here for the group because Prop 39 is something that is common across the country, though not in the same form, and that is where local school districts are required to provide schools, charter schools, access to empty or unutilized school district properties. So if a school has been closed in your area, even though it's been mothballed or not utilized for a long time, a charter school in the area typically has first option to utilize those facilities at very low rents or very low costs. I did, without going into the specifics of Proposition 39 specific eligibility requirements, because those kind of things vary across the country. One thing to keep in mind here is if there's an empty property at a school district, whether they're required to provide it to you or frankly they may be willing to sell it to or lease it to the charter school as a way for the district to get additional financial resources or income. And so while there are a lot of public hoops to jump through to access that kind of real estate. Districts across the country who have financial issues of their own are often willing to enter into long-term lease or sale agreements, whether required to by state law or not. So we've come to the end of the webinar today. I wanted to thank everybody for joining. We really had a great turnout today. I know you can't all see each other, but we had a great turnout today. I appreciate you all staying. The presentation is available for download again at slideshare.net/charterschoolcapital. We at Charter School Capital are here to help, whether you have working capital, growth capital, facilities financing needs, or project execution needs. Plus now in a dedicated way, and we appreciate the opportunity to work with your school going forward to help you sustain your operations, expand, and grow. Thank you again for joining us. We look forward to speaking with you in the future.